All right, so as we get started, understanding catabolism. So catabolism is the medical process where things break down. And we're going to be looking at Zhang Zihe. He's a scholar from the classical period of Chinese medicine. And he comes up with a theory we often call it's called the Gongxie Pai in Chinese, but we call it the purgation theory, about getting something out of your body. So we're going to look at this. This is really a radical departure from previous theory before it. I'm kind of looking at certain things that would key in such a radical change in intellectual history and trying to link that back to something physical changes. So Zhang Zihe, this is a scholar, right? And Zhang Zihe, we're going to talk a little bit about the background of when he, was and what was going on and why would he come up with this radical theory. Okay, so the academic schools are the Song Jin period. The Song Jin period is 960 to 1279 AD, right? So this period represents a flowering of the development and reinterpretation of the theories of traditional Chinese medicine. Now, there's a lot of complex social forces that are going on at this time in history, and they really drive a great intellectual revolution in the understanding and application of treatment principles. But we have to understand that this time period is really a change in Chinese history, that things are going on that are mercantile, that are business driven, that are altering the nature of Chinese society. And it's interesting because the Song period ends with the invasion by the Mongols in 1279. And then when the Ming pick up again after the Mongol Empire, they are very reactionary compared to what the Song are very progressive. So a lot of the changes that occurred in the Song are rolled back in the subsequent Ming dynasty. But at this time period when Zhang Zihe lived, complex social forces are driving things. Okay? And he was a core scholar in what we call the School of Purgation, the Gongxie Pai, which literally means administrate the negative school. That's what if you translate it directly. But we call it purgation because it would take the negative dynamics out of your body, the poisons out of your body, either by vomiting or by crying or by defecation or urination or by bleeding, actually cutting the skin and bleeding. It would say you have to remove something negative for something to be able to develop it, that the block in the system is the problem. He is actually one of what we call the Sidatsu in Chinese, which are the four great masters of the Song Jin period. So he's renowned and known. And whether you study East Asian medicine in China, Japan, Korea, or Vietnam, his theories are studied, they're looked at. So he is a core scholar. He's very well known. Okay? But his method stood in opposition to what we call tonic medicine, Wuya in Chinese, tonic medicine. Tonic medicines are things that make you stronger. And this really is a change in this time period between emphasizing the tonic approach, and he said, no, you have to purge or drain to better manage disease. And so really I'm trying to look at why would he change this theory? Why theories that are by the time he comes up to them, we're talking about theories that are 2,000 years old that have been used in medicine for 2,000 years. Why would he be a revisionist? Why would he change that? That's really what drove me to do this research. Okay, so we have to talk about some traditional concepts, quick, traditional treatment strategies. So the concept of Bu, tonifying, which means make stronger, and Xie, dispersing or draining. These are core ideas in traditional Chinese medicine. So they relate to what we call deficiencies, Xu, and excesses, Shi. These two things of how something is too little or too strong. Okay, and that's a core idea based on the ideas of yin and yang, not enough or too much. And so if we go back to the ancient texts, that a lot of these theories come from early books. One of the most famous of which, the Huangdi Neijing, right? This book, which is the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Internal Medicine, which dates back roughly 3,000 years from before today. It's the advice in there is that tonify when it's deficient, disperse when it's excess. Very simple, right? It's a simple situation, a linear pathology, right? Whether with the degradation of organic function, with the idea that if you don't have enough, make it strong. If you have too much, take it down. Very simple, very linear, very clear, very easy to understand. And that theory goes back almost 3,000 years in medicine. Now, the pathology of the body isn't always that simple. And so there's another very famous of the classical text called the Huangdi Bashiyi Nanjing, right? Which is the 81 complexities or 81 difficulties of the Yellow Emperor. And the Yellow Emperor is a mythical figure. And in these books, he is the student learning from a master teacher and asking all questions. They're kind of written almost like the Socratic dialogues are written as question answers. So, but in this text, they talk about long-standing imbalance. You work with the treatment principle. If it's deficient, tonify or strengthen the mother. In other words, where it comes from, the preceding or the supportive organ structure. And in cases of excess, if something is too much, disperse the child, which means then the organ systems that are deriving their metabolic impetus from wherever the problem arises. So they're saying that the problem can't always be treated directly. You have to treat it within the web or continuity of the whole body. And this uses a system we call the 5 phases: wood, fire, earth, metal, water, 5 forces that are seen to create a interweave in the body of how the body works. Okay, but still relatively straightforward, where you have strategies to take care of excess or deficient. Okay, and even in this text, the Nanjing, the classic of difficulties, it says you treat deficiency first. You always emphasize on the deficient or the weak side to fix that. Now, another third of these three texts are considered to be the most influential early texts, is something called the Shanghanlun. And the Shanghanlun means the injury by cold discussion, the discussion of how cold or external problems hurt you, how you get an infectious disease. And it was written in response to an epidemic. But here in that text, they talk about the complexity of a deficient or weak state and an excess or inflamed state, but it's still very limited because now in this text, they talk about the coexistence of both deficiencies and excesses at the same time. There's a weakness in one spot and excess in another, and how you have to treat it. And they're separated to be occurring in different parts of the body. And there's a section of this text called the Discourse of Balancing the Pulse, right? The Ping Mai Fa. This is a discussion where they parse out the diagnoses and say, and then there's an internal deficiency, yet an external excess, an internal excess, yes, an external deficiency. That the idea is that there's different ways that these things are brought forth in certain areas. Okay, so the clinician is kind of told, identify them clearly, linear treat each one. Be careful, don't strengthen the area where it's inflamed, don't weaken the area where it's deficient. Okay, and if you don't do that, you create iatrogenesis, doctor-induced disease. Okay, this is the platform of understanding that stood in place for the better part of, by the time Zhang Zihe comes along, almost 2,000 years, people have been talking in this format. Okay, so why would things change? Why would these early theories not explain the complexity that this scholar in the Song Jin period is looking at? So one of the things I've identified that really has not been brought out well is that the diet prior to the Song dynasty predominated in wheat, sorghum, barley, and millet. Chinese didn't eat a lot of rice in the early period. Rice was cultivated, but pre-Song rice farming techniques were not as developed. They had a lower yield, and the type of rice that they farmed was not as hardy. But something changes, and what changes in the Song dynasty, there's a big change, because Zhang Zihe lived in a time when there was explosive dynamic growth. And herein, we have a quotation, right? Between 960 and 1127, China goes through an economic growth unprecedented compared to the earlier Chinese history. Maybe compared to world history, this was one of the largest growth time periods. It was a combination of commercialization, urbanization, and low-grade industrialization, cottage industries and such. Not heavy refinery, but a type of business dynamic that led some authorities compare this period in Chinese history with the development of early modern Europe 6 centuries later in the 1600s, 1700s. That's what it was like. It was developing. But also there was an agricultural shift. Because in the early part of the Song dynasty, a new type of early ripening rice, a new type of rice was brought in from Champa. Champa was a kingdom which was in the Mekong River Delta, and now what we call Vietnam. Champa was that kingdom there. By the year 1012, it had been introduced in the lower Yangtze and Huai River Valley regions. This rice was more drought resistant. That was great. It could be grown in places where older varieties of rice couldn't grow, and especially on higher land and on terraces that climb up the hilly slopes, and it ripened even faster than other early ripening varieties of rice. This made double cropping possible. You could have 2 yields every year, and sometimes triple cropping. Right? So that was amazing. The hardiness and productivity of this rice was in large part responsible for why you have so many people in the southern part of China subsequently, right? Because of the strong, hardy rice. So this was a change. This was a big change in diet, a change in everyone's diet, and diet affects the metabolism very strongly. So I believe that diet is the operative factor in why you see the evolution of Zhang Zihe's theory. So there's several factors that are relevant to this. So a simpler diet, as you saw in the Qin Han period where those early texts come from, they had less access to meats and less access to fats, and they would have a lot of grains, millet, wheat, barley, and sorghum. Well, they actually carry fewer impurities, and they allow the human metabolism, kind of like a plant, to absorb metabolites that are nutrient rich but contaminant poor. So in such a dietary situation, nutrient insufficiency as a cause of disease can predominate. So you don't get enough of the nutrients you need. So your body can't anabolize, it can't grow, right? And so if it fails to catabolize, to break down, it's very linear. And so diet therapy is very straightforward in that situation. So addressing the linear failures can rectify this. So paucity or lack prevailed through most of the early period of the Han era, and that's when the TCM, the traditional Chinese medical tradition, was growing. So therefore, the tendency to tonify and rectify an omnipresent deficiency in diet and the metabolisms of the people. This makes sense. The tendency to tonify became a cornerstone until you see this change in diet in the time of Zhang Zihe. So what goes on with this is a changing diet and therefore changing metabolism. So this economic growth that we just talked about changed the culture patterns, changed the dietary patterns, and allowed an emerging financial elite, because the Song were the first ones in Chinese history to have paper money. Paper money makes faster velocity of capital. Faster velocity of capital makes more development, more innovation. All of this made people nouveau riche, able to have money and buy things, right? And they could buy expensive tonic medicines. They could buy special ginsengs and deer antlers and all sorts of things. And they became ever more available because there's economic demand. But this shift in diet, right, especially to a larger volume of rice, could have played a central role in Zhang's theory. Why? Rice uptakes more contaminants than other grains that were traditionally grown in China before that. For example, the arsenic levels in rice are exponentially higher than other grains. In 2013, the US Food and Drug Administration released a study on 656 different rice products, demonstrating the volume of inorganic arsenic in them was so high, they advised children not to ingest them more than once in a week. An earlier Food and Drug Administration study showed up to 7.2 micrograms preserving of arsenic in raw grain rice, while the level of arsenic in millet was so low, you can't measure it. So big difference in the arsenic. And arsenic, why is there arsenic in rice? That's a natural uptake by the rice to protect itself against the predators, the insect predators that eat it. So rice naturally takes up arsenic. It's not a poison that we put in the rice. Long-term exposure to arsenic is actually insidious to the body. Regular exposure to small amounts of arsenic can increase the risk of bladder, lung, skin cancer, as well as heart disease and type 2 diabetes. Recent studies also suggest arsenic exposure in utero can have effects on the baby's immune system. So this is a really interesting thing. You see this shift that occurred during this period when Zhang Zihe was writing. Okay, so coming back to Zhang Zihe and his response to this, the shift to more rice consumption in the Song period would have increased the presence of the environmental contaminants, right, such as an increase in arsenic levels. In such a state, the previous rubric, to tonify, anabolize, or make stronger, was not really as reliable, and in fact, could be deleterious, could be negative. So Zhang responded to the presence of this iatrogenic effect. The doctor was tonifying all the time. Oh, you're weak, take this, you're weak, take this. But people weren't getting better. We observed that the presence of invasive factors, right, intrinsic excesses, intrinsic accumulations within the metabolism, it denies the tonic medicine's ability to work correctly. You can't strengthen a system that's poisoned. So here we see a shift from the emphasis on anabolism, known as tonifying technique in Chinese medicine, to catabolism, or dispersion, or purgative theory. So he examined the venues from which excess goes out of the body. He looked at sweat, vomit, stools, urine, blood, right, or even emotional purging. He looked at this as saying, these things have to be clear. He had a famous line, don't lock the gate with the thief in the house, right? Don't lock up after you have the problem. Get the thief out, get the problem out. Okay, so we have to look at why this eradication, right? So he said, if you tonify when there's an excess, you irritate it, you create a negative and consumptive inflammation, it can develop to the point where it destroys or degrades your body. The understanding is analogized to increasing anabolic response without normal catabolism. If your body anabolizes or grows and doesn't break things down, you're going to grow a problem, right? Because what happens is you could grow a tumor and grow a mass. So increased anabolism can lead to an excited immune response, which we call histotoxic response or cytokine storm, and autoimmune degradation, where your body's immune system attacks itself, right? But also the overabundant use of tonics, which bolster up anabolism, makes accelerated growth, your body can't break it down, and too much cellular reproduction. So unrestricted tonification or anabolism can imply cellular reproduction that doesn't stop without contact inhibition. In other words, cells keep growing without stopping to touch them, and the result can be a cancer. Okay? This process can be compounded by increased amount of cytotoxins, and arsenic is a cytotoxin. So third, also, the economic development and lifestyle led to greater access to animal products as food. People had more money, they had more fats and more meats. Increased animal products also carry greater amounts of unnecessary metabolites, and they accumulate in the organism, usually in fat stores, and fat tends to store toxins. These cytotoxins should be removed from the body in the natural catabolic process. However, depending on what you eat, depending on if you're taking these anabolic tonifiers, right, large amounts of unusable metabolites will be stored up and they confound being eliminated because you keep taking them in. The higher levels of these deleterious materials can result in what we call heteropathic behavior of the metabolism, which means your body starts to act very strange, starts to attack itself, starts to wall itself off, starts to make masses and tumors and growths. Okay. So realistically now, as we kind of wrap this up, how can we understand his theories in the modern day? How's it relevant to us? Not just how is it relevant in history. History is very interesting, but history of medicine should hopefully inform modern practice. Our modern processed diet, where we tend to use a plethora of preservatives and food additives, results in a vast amount of useless metabolites that are in our food. So our bodies accumulate large amounts of useless chemical substances, and we have to get rid of them. It's, in fact, the amount of preservatives in the American diet means that you can exhume a body up to 2 years after it's been buried, and it hasn't degraded. Right? Where in the 1800s, they used to have to exhume a body within 6 months to be able to get any relevant information. So we last because we eat so much preservatives. But we deny the normal purgative venues. We use antiperspirant to not sweat. We take medicines to stop nausea or stop diarrhea because we don't want to be inconvenienced. We use artificial hormones to regulate the menstrual bleeding. We also use psychiatric medications to limit emotional responses. We kind of shut down all the purgative responses in the body. We also take a lot of tonic stimulants that are readily available in our society to maintain lifestyle. Modern society has modern stimulants. In the United States, we have Red Bull and Monster Energy drink, and we have all these we have lots of coffee and caffeine and highly caffeinated sodas. All of this and revolves around an ever-increasing workday with more stimulation and an ever-shrinking sleep period. Right? This is what the 21st century has brought to us, is a change in lifestyle again. So Zhang's purgation theory, this theory that he had back in the Song dynasty, can explain why we have an increase in cancer. Why do we have an increase in autoimmune diseases? Right? Why do we have idiopathic inflammatory states? And even studying Western medicine, inflammation is now understood to create hypoxia. Hypoxia is lack of oxygenation. Hypoxia starts to damage cells and create a loss of contact inhibition, and is considered a major venue of understanding the formation of cancer. So this theory, this old theory, if we could appropriately apply his purgation theory, right, whether within traditional Chinese medicine or within the larger aspect of Western or modern medicine, then perhaps some of our modern disease states could yield to his sophisticated treatment method. That's really the value of this. So we could look at the different herbs, the different formulas, the different things he used to purge things out, and maybe by looking at them through chemical analysis, there may be certain chemicals that could be rarefied into pharmaceuticals or into medicines that could help eliminate some of these triggers that give us these modern or supposedly modern diseases, these problems of excess or accumulation. Okay? So that's my presentation. Thank you for listening. Okay.